Greetings, programs, and welcome to Railway Empire, which is a game where you play with choo-choo trains. Yeah, that's basically it. This was actually gifted to me by a patron, and I then went and bought one of the DLC, the Britain and Ireland DLC, which is why we're seeing the British Isles right now. And this game, as might not be terribly surprising to learn, is one of the many that was inspired by Transport Tycoon, or rather, I think more specifically, what preceded Transport Tycoon, Railroad Tycoon. Because you are just playing with trains. Unlike Transport Tycoon, where you have a lot more options and you can set up integrated networks, or you can just concentrate on, planes, ships, trains, or what was the other one? Road vehicles. Yes, including trams. And obviously, if you want trams, you have to play Open Transport Tycoon, but trams are still a thing there. And there've also been other open source, well, at least one other open source game that's been inspired by Transport Tycoon as well, namely Simutrans, which is a little different in that passengers and goods have specific destinations. But this is a lot more like, oh, be quiet. This is a lot more like the original Transport Tycoon in that as long as a town or well, actually, no, it is a town. As long as a town can accept a specific kind of product, a specific good, then it will take it up to the needs of the town. Unlike Transport Tycoon, you're not transporting stuff between businesses on the map. I mean, you kind of are, because there are businesses that happen only in towns. You're basically transporting raw materials from around the map to the manufacturing businesses that are actually in the towns, and then you transport the goods from town to town to make extra money that way. But it's still reasonably complicated. I think they've taken out they've quite obviously made the effort to take out a lot of the micromanagey stuff from Transport Tycoon, which is a good thing and a bad thing. It's a bit more streamlined as a result, but at the same time you then don't have the kind of fine scale tools that you have for doing different things in Transport Tycoon. That said, you can still do a lot of the things you could do in Transport Tycoon. It's just maybe not quite as neatly as you possibly could. So let's actually do one of the things you can do in this game and ride along with one of the trains, which is one of the neat features. It's not just this overhead map view. Let's get one of my cross-country trains. It is in fact possible to, here we go, take a look at one of my mallards, which for some reason is looking very rusty. You can actually look around a little bit as well, different camera views. Although I don't particularly like this one. It's a little bit, being strapped to the front of the train. But yeah, so it's got that train set quality to it as well. But you can't just sit and admire the trains. You do have to keep tabs on what the business is doing, because your AI rivals, just like in Transport Tycoon, can cause you problems to the point of even buying you out. But that goes both ways. You can also buy out their businesses as well, just like you could in Transport Tycoon. So there's a lot of design cues. This is definitely a spiritual sequel to Transport Tycoon. There's absolutely no question about it. This is not really trying to reinvent anything. It's just trying to streamline things, which is sort of, appropriate that I'm looking at a mallard as I say that. Talking about streamlining. So let's look at some specifics. The map obviously has it's all moved away from the very tile-based system that you saw in Transport Tycoon. So in terms of no, we don't want that. In terms of laying down track and whatever else, well, you can only really lay track from either existing track or from endpoints, i.e. stations or depots or warehouses. So it's quite intuitive for the most part, but as you can see, it's a bit of a spaghetti mess my system, and this is my first proper game at this. I did a little bit of the campaign, because there's the campaign mode. The base game has the United States as its kind of campaign area, but this is a sandbox game, not a sandbox, a free mode game where you just play the game against the AI. And there's also a sandbox mode where I don't think you have to worry about money or anything like that. You can just it's like, you might as well call that the train set mode, because that's basically what that is. It's just creating pretty networks without having to worry about actually keeping the light switched on. So yeah, you can see where the endpoints of station tracks are by these the green markers when you zoom out far enough, and you just click and drag and well, not even drag, you just click to put things down, and as you can see, it's a bit you know, it likes to make curves. It's harder to make straight lines. It can be done. You have to click and drag the control points a fair bit, but as you can see, this particular area we can't actually put track down here because it doesn't have enough room to come off this curve. So if I wanted to do that, I'd have to demolish this bridge and redo whole sections of track. And this is one of my less favourite parts about this game, is redoing bits of track, redoing stations that you need to do occasionally is a real pain in the bum. There's no easy way to edit stuff you've already put down, especially as if you start deleting bits of track, you can end up deleting whole massive sections of track. Although it's possible to break stuff up if you put down signals, for instance. If I put down like a signal here, it'll then treat those sections of track as being different before and after the signal. Or did I put down a signal, or did I put down... I don't know, I meant to put down a signal. Maybe I put down a supply tower by mistake. So it's possible to break stuff up manually, and with the signals it's free. As you can see, signals don't cost anything. And just like Transport Tycoon, the signalling does matter if you choose it to matter when you're setting a game up. You can take the easy option where there's no signalling and you don't have to worry about making parallel tracks and one-way tracks and all this kind of thing. The trains will just kind of merge through each other in a kind of ghostly fashion. So that's the kind of the easy mode, as it were, with not having to worry about the signalling. But having played many years of Transport Tycoon and Open Transport Tycoon and a bit of Simutrans as well, I figured I was up to the challenge of having a go with the various different types of signalling. And it's not even that many types of signalling, especially compared to Transport Tycoon, where it can get a bit confusing. It's literally just directional ordinary signals or one-way signals, so you can create stretches of one-way track, which are represented by, here we go, the crawling tram lines. Now I've got lots of these loops like this, and I mean, this was really my first proper full go at it. It would have been a lot neater if I'd done lots of sections like this, because the game does, once you've put down a line of track, it makes it a lot easier to put down some parallel track. It snaps very nicely. So that's a really nice feature if you want to create parallel sections of track. It's really easy to do so, as long as the elevation isn't too wacky or there isn't stuff blocking the way like town buildings or somebody else's infrastructure. So the actual process of building is quite intuitive. It's, like I say, it's the process of trying to edit stuff and redo junctions and whatever else that can get a bit tedious. Like all this track around Air Station, for example, I redid that many times as I was kind of learning as I went along, and it required multiple deletions, paying out lots of cash, and eventually getting this system which sort of works, but can still be a bit of a choke point. Now, over in Ireland, and let's just casually ignore the fact that I built a bridge across the Irish Sea, which is a weird, like a weirdly topical thing to mention at the moment, considering there's some stuff in the news about Boris Johnson having apparently decided to commission a report into the feasibility of building a bridge from Scotland to Ireland. I'm not making this up. This is an actual thing that's presumably connected to the Brexit madness. Yeah, if we come across to Ireland, we'll see, a lot more network, but this is actually network that was set up by one of my AI competitors that I then bought out. Now, it seems like you only ever have 4 competitors. One of them I bought out, one of them I fully own, and I could buy out, and it would basically, I would then just either inherit or liquidate their rolling stock, or I think I could liquidate everything if I wanted to. But when they're in this state, basically you get all their profits, but they don't expand at all. They become static and just run the network that they've got. So, but what I did actually fully take over the AI competitor in Ireland, and thereby found a couple of problems. Now, I mentioned the tracks through Air Station. The AI likes to do that a lot, it would seem. It doesn't do a lot of these endpoint stations. It does a lot of stations that run through when it's setting up networks. And when I took this over as a player, I found some horrendous bottlenecks, like trains backed up all the way down here. There were trains backed up all the way around Dublin as well. And one of the kind of annoyances of this game is, alongside the difficulty with editing tracks, is that it likes to bunch all of your train routes through a single station track if you have this kind of through track system set up. And so you'd end up with, and it tells you the utilization. The worst I've seen was it was like 204%. And so this is why I had this massive tailback of trains just waiting, because we had trains from both sides trying to use just this one single track. And it wasn't that they'd been specifically told to use that one single track, it's that it defaults to one single track. And so here's an area where actually you do have to micromanage quite intensively. You have to make sure that when you have these multi-track stations that you are splitting up the load between all of the tracks so that it actually keeps the traffic going. And I don't know why the game doesn't do that automatically. It kind of feels like it should. And instead you, the player, have to sit down and figure it out. So that caused me a bit of a headache in some places. And not so much on my own network as I set it up, because this is probably a really inefficient network that I've set up going through Scotland into the lowlands and a bit of the north of England. Although I do have this one spur, this one mega expensive spur that goes all the way down to Swansea, because for some reason, for a long, long time, Swansea was the last unconnected city in the entirety of the British Isles. The AI didn't want Swansea, and so finally I took pity on it and built this mega expensive track. But there's a lot of ways in which, looking back, I definitely could have made this more efficient in terms of laying down track, but also in terms of utilising the tools the game does give you, because you've got 2 types of stations. You've got these ordinary stations which accept and give out just any goods that happen to be in that city. So in Glasgow it is ham, cloth and cheese, and that's then occupying the 3 industry slots, which is the maximum that a city can take. You also get an extra building slot that can have some bonus effects, but we're not talking about that. We're talking about the other kind of station, which is a warehouse. And warehouses let you transship goods, because unlike Transport Tycoon, you don't have quite the... let's have a look-see. Sure, let's buy that. I've got all of the money right now. You don't have quite the level of control over train routes. Okay, yeah, I want to continue playing. Let's just ignore the final score. Although I think I did all right. I was like top... I only got a ticket vendor, never mind. But in terms of monetary value, I did all right competitively. Yeah, what was I talking about? Train routes. So let's pick on, say, my Newcastle to Edinburgh line. Look at the rail line, and it does give you a little bit of control, but unlike Transport, well, it's a lot more like Transport Tycoon than Simutrans, but you can't be quite as specific about where you want stuff to load goods and unload goods. And that's kind of where warehouses come into play. Now you can tell them to priority load specific goods. In this case it's only passengers or mail, because I've set it to be a passenger or mail service only. But if this was set as an automatic or a freight service, we could ban certain types of goods, prioritize certain types of goods. So you can have some level of control. That's not really a problem. But when you are setting up lines like this, you then, it's exactly the same in Transport Tycoon. If you want to make any changes, you then have to propagate those changes through any trains that are running on any additional instances of that route, say, that you've added. So for my cross-country route here, where I've got 3 trains all running on the same route, if I wanted to make a specific change, I would have to actually make that change individually to each of those. That's not what I meant to click. Simbutrans, on the other hand, I always liked that way of doing it more, and this is exactly what I'm talking about with stuff. Like, the AI seems to not be it does not assign train station tracks in the way a human player can, and it seems to fail badly. I'm getting sidetracked though. Yeah, Simutrans lets you set up routes and then actually assign stuff to that route. So any changes that you make to the route propagate to everything that is assigned to that route, which has always seemed the much more sensible way to do it. So this is a change where it would have been good to see it more like that than how it is. But yeah, as I said, there's a reasonable amount of control, and if you want to transship goods, instead of being able to tell the train unload goods here, what you do is you set up one of these warehouse stations and you say, I want this warehouse to accept that type of good, and it will stockpile it up to a maximum of 99 units, 99 train cars basically. And at that point you can then have trains running from the warehouse to other places, and so you can use your warehouses as basically hubs for specific goods. But you can also link them. As you can see, this is linked to Glasgow. It's close enough to Glasgow that this this blue bar is appearing. Then any goods that Glasgow wants, which is basically all of these goods, will automatically go from the stockpile to meet Glasgow's demands. So it's quite that's a neat system. I like that way of doing it. It's something you could do with Transport Tycoon, but it would involve fiddling with the individual trains a lot more to unload them at a specific station, and then to have another train come and pick up those goods. And so there's a little bit less control on the level of the trains themselves, but this is a very neat solution to do it. And it was only relatively late on that I actually grasped that. So going back down to Swansea, what I did was, instead of choking the approaches to Swansea with a bunch of train lines, which I couldn't really fit in because at this point it's such a spaghetti junction of the two AIs train networks that trying to run trains like this route I built here, for instance, this massive bridge to go over all of these rail lines. So yeah, I knew I had a limited space, and you can't set up I mean, you can be fairly clever with your switching, but not, and again, you don't quite have the level of control that you could maybe set up with Transport Tycoon. So what I decided to do was set up this depot, which has goods mostly for taking to Swansea, but chemicals which are being produced by Swansea and then being shipped up to Glasgow, up this west coast route here. So yeah, stuff comes and deposits their goods at this depot, and then I have some trains that specifically just shuttle back and forth and take them to Swansea. And the only real downside of this system is, compared to Transport Tycoon, where there was basically an unlimited amount of stuff that you could have stored at stations, you have, with the biggest type of warehouse, just 6. And so if what you're going to end up having with if you embrace this more fully, which with another playthrough I might well try doing, is basically you would end up having to have multiple warehouses, maybe one for goods coming in, one for goods going out, which might end up with a bit more complexity in terms of the rails laid down. Now there's some other little niggles I have with the game as well. You can only have 2 stations per town. With Open Transport Tycoon specifically, it lets you have as many... well, you can only have a set number of stations per town, but the number of tracks you can have going into those stations, you can basically paint the stations down and have quite odd looking stations. You can have stations with like a couple of tracks going that way and then a couple of tracks coming off that way, you know, like facing a completely different direction. It basically lets you be very organic with your placement of stations, and you can also have non-contiguous stations. So you can have a station that is one specific station, but it might have one set of station tracks over here and then another set of station tracks over here, but it's still the same train station. But sadly this game doesn't do that, and so what tends to happen is you end up active in like your starting region. Mine was I picked Glasgow as my start, so I've got all these networks in Glasgow, and as you can see on the minimap here, you've got these dots for the cities where it's like a bi-coloured dot. Well, that means that it's 2 companies have stations in that town, and that means, for instance, Cambridge. I can't now build a train station in Cambridge, even if I wanted to. The game just won't let me because there's a maximum of a flat maximum of 2 per city. That doesn't apply to the supply side of things, all the businesses that are outside the city. You can build as many stations around them as you can kind of physically fit within the radius, essentially. But that limitation on 2 per city, it's a real hindrance in the later game, because you have that limit of 3 manufacturing businesses per town, and for some reason, starting off in Scotland, an awful lot of them were ham. I think there were 1 or 2 that were producing cider, but basically, yeah, all of the lowland ones produced ham and all the highland ones produced cider. So there's not a lot of variety when you start out. So taking the more complex business chains into account, and I don't know if I can, like the chemical industry might be one of them. There's things like tools. Some of the later ones, see if there's any that have one of the more complex chains. Steel. Here we go. Plymouth has steel, which requires coal and iron ore. There's ones that require more finished goods, so you can have by the later game, I think by around 1900 or so, car manufacturing is a thing that can pop up, that you can get businesses doing, and they require steel and fuel has to be made elsewhere, and steel has to be made elsewhere. So you can get these potentially quite complex industry chains popping up, but in practice I've not seen that happen, just because by the time the towns have grown to that point, the industry slots have started to get filled up anyway. I mean, there's still some cities here that have that 3rd industry slot if they grow a bit, but getting them the stuff that they need to grow, it becomes an increasingly complex task, because you can't necessarily go and get it from somewhere that's producing it if you don't have a station there already, because you've already hit that limit of 2 per town. Now there might be a way around that, and having said all that, it may well be possible to place a warehouse. Aha, apparently it is. Okay, I didn't even think of that until just now, although Leeds is actually a really bad place to test because I have got a station in Leeds already. But if you wanted to make a linked station to somewhere that has 2, yes, so you can build a warehouse station and you will still make money from goods and services. So apparently I can retract most of what I've said. there. You can still do that in the late game. Then you can put down warehouse stations, but that just then means you can't do passenger and mail transport from towns that have two things. See, even as I've played this for like 10 hours already, I'm still learning stuff. It only just occurred to me that, oh yeah, no, you can put warehouses outside of... Okay, yeah, I'm sure there'll be a bunch of comments pointing that out, and then I'll be able to tell the people that put comments in before they got to this point of the video. Anyway, so yeah, you still can do that. Okay, but you know, you still end up with this issue of the spaghetti mess, like putting in this north-south track quite apart from the just the length, because the number of bridges involved, and there's a couple of tunnels as well, which are super expensive. That was about 1.5 million, something like that. But I mean, at that point I had the money, so it really wasn't that much of an issue. It was like, okay, 1.5 million on track, and I'm sitting on like 10 million at the moment. Okay, not really a big deal, but the actual planning of the route was a bit of a faff. So yeah, that's a bit of a kind of, you know, like in the late game things get a bit choked in a way that never really happened in Transport Tycoon, just because you didn't have that limitation on ordinary stations per city.
I've only just noticed that we are neighbors.
And there's a couple of other things as well. I mean, we'll come back to this bridge here. Because it's just trains, there's no like, even if they just had special boat train terminals as a thing that you could do as an endpoint, that would be something, but there aren't. So you end up having to sometimes build these rather ridiculous bridges because there is a limitation with I can't really do it at the moment, I don't think, anymore, but specifically with the city stations, passenger stations, you have to connect them to your home station, your hub. You can't have non-contiguous train networks. I couldn't build, for instance, and I kind of learned this fairly early on, I couldn't build a Glasgow to Edinburgh thing and then build a separate line from, say, Dundee to Aberdeen. No, I had to first build a line up to Dundee, and then I could build Aberdeen as a station. Because you can place down a station that's unconnected, the game will let you do that. But if you try and place down another one, you get a little pop-up saying, no, this station has to be connected to your network first. So yeah, it's not really... I mean, it kind of forces everything to be integrated, which in terms of the late game is not necessarily a bad thing, but, you know, on this specific map, when I built a station in Derry, for example, because I'd bought one of the businesses somewhere, I can't even remember which one it was, and I thought I might as well take advantage of that, ship grain to Derry because the AI is not doing it. And what happened was I tried to build another station somewhere. The game went, oh no, you can't do that, and I had to then spend, and I think this was an even more absurdly amount of money I spent just because of this stupidly long bridge here. It was something like £2.5 million building a bridge across the Irish Sea, which is totally, you know, like logistically feasible with 1850s technology or 1860s or whenever I built it, all because there was this weird limitation of having to link up every single bit of your passenger networks. It might let you get away with having non-contiguous warehouse-based networks if you were just moving goods around. I might have to test that out a bit, because I think a thing you can do in this game, you could concentrate on freight only. But, and again, this is a little niggle, unlike Transport Tycoon, heck, even unlike, I think, the original Railroad Tycoon, the game forces you to do everything. If you want to do passengers, basically, you have to do freight. You could just do freight only, but I have a feeling maybe towns wouldn't grow if you're not taking passengers between them. I don't know that for sure.
Wow. Your trains don't run smoothly.
I think the town growth is very strongly tied to what stuff you bring into the town. I don't know how much of a link there is also with moving passengers about the place. But in Transport Tycoon, you could be really granular. Like, you can choose to have a passenger-only vehicle-based business, or just freight trains. Hell, you could do freight aircraft if you wanted. You could have a mixed network. You could do trains only. You could do, trains and buses, and have things a bit more integrated, and just, shuffle passengers around. So there was different ways of doing things, but in this game, yeah, you can't do passengers only. You really kind of have to do freight as well. And if nothing else, if you did passengers only, I suspect what would happen is eventually the AI would just buy out your company. Because not only can you buy the stock in other companies, but they can buy stock in you. So 84% of my company is owned by this guy, but I own 40% of his company. In fact, one of the reasons why I was kind of saving up money in the late game was just to see how much I could, if I could buy his company before the end of the game. But his share price has gone up so much that, yeah, I can still buy a reasonable chunk at a time. But it's quite a lot of money, as you can see. So yeah, overall the game, it's not perfect. It has its little issues, and I have had it crash on me once as well. But in 10 hours of play, I mean, that's not terrible. It would have been better if it had not crashed at all. But it does have a fairly frequent autosave function, so it wasn't really that big of an issue. So yeah, it doesn't really replace Transport Tycoon. It doesn't replace Simutrans, which I don't know if I mentioned that as a thing. That's worth checking out if you fancy something a bit different, because this game, much like Transport Tycoon, has passengers and goods just wanting to go wherever they can be accepted. Simutrans takes the basic formula of Transport Tycoon and says, well, what if passengers and goods have a specific destination? And it makes things a lot more interesting. It doesn't make as much sense as in terms of freight, but it makes a lot of sense in terms of passengers. And it makes the way you build your transport networks rather different as well. I mean, that's a game that encourages building integrated transport networks just on the basis of how goods and passengers move around. Where in this, it's not really anything like that. It's just the game forcing you to do it via this artificial limitation of you must have all of your city-to-city connections connected in a single network, whether you like it or not. You have no choice about this. So yeah, it's worth picking up on sale, I'd say. There's also plenty of DLC to add a bit of flavour, but it's nowhere near as in depth as the various add-ons that you get for Open Transport Tycoon, where you can get a complete train set going from, well, heck, if you start with the correct vehicle mods, you can basically start with like stagecoaches and wagons and go from like literally 1800 to 2050 if you want. This game doesn't have quite that longevity. You get 100 years of playtime, which is still all right. And it's just a bit odd the way it mixes and matches your like the actual British trains, like this Gresley A4 Pacific, with American freight trains. And presumably if I had other DLC, those trains would pop in as well, although I don't know that for sure. It might just use the trains from the base game mixed in with whatever DLC map you're playing. So yeah, it's all right. It's worth the look-see if you are a fan of the classic Transport Tycoon. But just be aware, it does have its limitations, even though it does also do one or two things quite nicely as well. Especially, and I really like this depot system. It's very neat. So that is Railway Empire, which is on Steam and presumably other places as well. And just for, just for reasons, I'll also stick in a link to Simutrans and OpenTTD, just in case you're unaware of those as well somehow, because they're also worth checking out. And heck, if you think you might like this, you can go and check those out first because they're free, and see if you can get a taste for it there. And if you do, then you might decide this game is worth spending some money on, because obviously the graphics are a lot prettier and you actually get to see the choo-choo trains rolling along in action, and you can honk their whistles. It's not quite Train Simulator, but it's not that far off. And it's maybe even a little bit more engaging than Train Simulator, which is basically just, a train set, a virtual train set, which this kind of can be as well. So that's it for this video. Hopefully you have found it interesting. And if you have, you can do all the usual things down underneath it. And of course, as always, stay tuned for more.